And now, Catherine McKenna, Arunabha Ghosh, and Manish Bapna of the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Good morning.
Bapna with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Really delighted to be with you here today. We're going to talk a lot about some developments in the climate world over the past few years. If you think about the climate world over the last few decades, the conversation has started to shift from one that is primarily about ambition, about how we take bold commitments, to recognizing we also need to be talking about implementation, how we actually translate those commitments to real action on the ground. We're in the decade of delivery. The climate conversation has also shifted from one that has historically been primarily about states, about national governments, to one that also recognizes non-state actors, businesses, investors, states, cities, regions, play a critical role in solving the climate challenge. This panel is going to focus quite a bit in that quadrant around non-state actors, implementation, and how we use that to spur even greater ambition. Earlier this year, the UN Secretary General launched a high-level expert group on net zero commitments by non-state actors. Now that's a mouthful. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that expert group actually is going to do, why it's so important and exciting. We've got two distinguished speakers with us today to help us do that. We have Catherine McKenna, who is a swimmer. In her spare time, she chairs this UN high-level group. She was formerly the Environment and Climate Change Minister of Canada. And we have Arunabha Ghosh, an opera singer, who also, in his spare time, is the CEO of the Council of Energy, Environment, and Water, based out of India. So, Catherine, let's get started. This expert group, could you tell us a little bit more about its mandate, its kind of what you hope to achieve? What is it? And why is it important?
So first of all, it's awesome being here. It was great that we just had a panel with some really amazing women. And I first came to Miami Beach as Minister of Environment and Climate Change for Canada under Justin Trudeau's government. And we talked about adaptation and talked about the impacts of climate change that Miami and Miami Beach are already experiencing. So clearly this is a really important topic, and it's great to be here. And I did swim this morning. It was good. It was very wavy. So if you're going to do a couple of kilometers, be ready. So look, the best way, probably the pithiest way to put this is net zero commitments by business, by investors, by cities are not a get out of jail free card. That hopefully translates a bit of what we're trying to do. I'm all focused on outcomes. So the reality is the science is dire. We are very far from where we need to be. And in fact, there was science that came out today that said, we're going to be out of reach of 1.5 very soon if we don't get our act together. So get our act together. The good news is we know what we need to do, but we need everyone swimming in the same direction and much faster. So really, we have governments. Obviously, they play a leading role, but the focus of our group is really looking at businesses, investors, cities, regions. What are they doing when they commit to net zero by 2050? How do we make sure the standards are strong and consistent with environmental integrity and the science? And then how do we make sure that the action is happening right now, that we're not talking about 2050? And I do have a funny story maybe we'll talk about at one point about someone who gave up drinking. They said they're going to give up drinking in 2050 or 2049. So if you wait till 2040, and they got credit for not drinking in the past. So maybe it's 2060. We don't have time for that. So it's about getting action now and holding folks to account.
Arunabha, you're also on the committee, the expert group. Tell us a little bit more about what success would look like, and maybe also tell a little bit from the perspective of the developing world.
Sure. Good day to everyone. Great to be on this panel, and great to be following Catherine's leadership. To use a different analogy, Catherine is a swimmer, my wife is a swimming champion, so I'm not going to go down the swimming route, but I'm learning how to ride a horse these days. Really what we need to do is go from the trot to the gallop, right? And a few years ago, we weren't even walking. And you've got a bunch of companies and other so-called non-state actors, cities, regions, saying that they want to walk the talk, right? And that's what this panel is about. But how can we gallop the talk? And how do we make sure that it's actually going in the right direction? How do we make sure that the horse is under control? How do we make sure you're jumping higher and higher as we go along? And so for me, Manish, the very first objective of what success would look like for a group like this is between when we come out with a set of recommendations and say next year, how much more would we have nudged real, credible action in terms of new commitments from non-state actors or pathways for the commitments that they've made? It's one thing to say, this is what we'll do. It's something completely different to say, this is how we are going to get there. The other big, at least success factor for me would be that, at the end of the day, it's in the developing economies and in the emerging economies where the bulk of the sustainable infrastructure will be needed. Now, how will the commitments from non-state actors translate into on-ground investments in the very regions where the climate crisis is happening as we talk, and yet where the sustainable infrastructure is needed? So that connection between the commitment to walking the talk, to the action on the ground, if we can demonstrate that connection, I think we'll build in a lot more buy-in from a number of actors who felt that the talk has not been walked so far.
Let's really take maybe just one step back and talk, Catherine, if you could say a little bit about why non-state actors matter and how they relate to the broader conversation on climate, and a little bit about these net zero commitments. What was the origins and what is missing in them from what you see?
Okay, so I want to make us hopeful because it can be doom and gloom, and I can go either way. But I'm going to be like the glass half full for the answer to this question only. But look. So when I was I started as new minister, went to Paris in 2015. We got an ambitious agreement where every country agreed they need to do their part, and we had a clear temperature goal well below 2 degrees, striving for 1.5. And guess what happened? You guys had an election here in 2016. For those of you who are Americans, so that was hard. That was the next COP. That was COP 22. Many people cried. But the good news is that we saw non-state actors. We saw in the United States, we saw cities, we saw businesses, we saw investors step up. I actually remember when Donald Trump tweeted, he said, we're out of the Paris Agreement, which actually he couldn't actually do because it takes years to get out. But we had actually investors. We had the CEO of Goldman Sachs said actually we're in. And then there was this whole movement, and that was really powerful. And like Miami Beach, mayors around the country said in the U.S., we're going to do things. So that's the good news. But the reality is it's just not good enough to say you're going to be net zero by 2050. And let's be clear, the UN Secretary General is very worried about greenwashing. And greenwashing isn't just that you're going to do it in 2050. As I said, we got to be doing it now. And we're in a particular time, and I won't go down the rabbit hole too much, but it is important to recognize with the war in Ukraine, we now have a bunch of folks who are like, well, maybe we should go build some new fossil fuel infrastructure. Of course, we have a challenge in the short term in terms of, how do we get, people to be able to turn on their lights, heat their homes if we get off Russian gas. But we cannot be locking in more emissions in the long term. That makes no sense. First of all, that doesn't make any economic sense. That's called stranded assets. And I think that is not unrelated to what the panel needs to do, because we need to provide discipline. When I was environment minister, we just had buckets, and I'd be like, okay, how are we reducing emissions in transportation? How are we reducing emissions in energy? How are we reducing emissions in buildings? That's what climate is about. It's about doing the work. And so I think for us, it is like, okay, how are we going to grade your homework? First of all, what are you setting as a target? You better be net zero by 2050, but we could spend a lot of time on what's net, right? Like how much of this are you buying credits? And are those credits even real? So there's that piece. But assuming that you are net zero by 2050, you need a trajectory, you need interim targets, you need to actually show the work. And it is important when you have meetings and you show your shareholders what you're doing. So maybe executive compensation should be tied to this. So I think there's a lot of pieces to this so we get real action. I only care about real action, and I care about real action right now because I have 3 kids and we do not have time.
It reminds me, my 12-year-old son came home a couple weeks ago on Earth Day, and he said he learned this at school. Pessimists are right more often. Optimists win more often. So I like that, but really like that about what we need today to be the analog or to get us on the roadmap to what net zero in 2050 would look like. So Arunabha, Glasgow was chock full of lots of commitments. 700 of the 2,000 largest publicly traded companies in the world have made net zero commitments. In Glasgow, $130 trillion in the finance space was made net zero commitments. Tell me a little bit more about these commitments. Are they real? What's working, what's not working, and how can this expert group help businesses and finance stay on track and create action today?
So I think the COP process, there's a negotiation part of the COP process, and then there is everything else. And it's increasingly, that's where we need to be focusing a little bit of our attention, because it's that everything else. It's what are the companies saying? What are the cities saying? What are the investors saying? What are the innovators looking for in terms of signals? Now, in a way, there's that phrase of, the flag follows trade, right? So can negotiations and the commitments that that countries are making now not be leading what companies are doing, but the other way around, that if companies and cities and regions can demonstrate action on the ground, that actually gives state negotiators the confidence to come up and say, hang on, our private sector has done more. 12 years ago when I set up my organization, CEW, India had less than 20 megawatts of solar. Today we have 50,000 megawatts of solar, 105,000 megawatts of solar and wind and biomass. We're aiming for 500,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity by the end of this decade. That means that the 20 minutes we spend here today having this conversation, private sector in India should have built out another about 3 to 4 megawatts of renewables. Every hour, 10 megawatts of renewables needs to be deployed. And the great thing is that the investment in renewables or in electric mobility or in cleaning up industry, that is coming from the private sector. It's the older assets that are more state-owned. So the point about, back to what was announced or the series of announcements that came out in Glasgow, whether it's Race to Zero, whether it's the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, etc., the huge range of acronyms. But really behind all of them is that there is this now at least a sense of a willingness or a desire to walk the talk. And what we are trying to do is, give it a leg up, give it a push, give it a nudge. And if they can lead, one more thing I want to say, it's not just about the large conglomerates. Large conglomerates have a long line of other industries in the supply chain. 40% of India's industrial sector is micro, small, and medium enterprises, 63 million of them. They're in some large conglomerate supply chain. So how do we bring in energy efficiency there? How do we change the energy infrastructure there? So if the large groups move, then there is a long tail that can follow as well. And that's where we need to be focusing on where is the investment going? Is it sending the right signals? Is it creating the investment flow in the regions to the people, to the companies that actually need this stuff?
So really powerful. So the point here is that you see this ambition loop, right? We are off track. We know that. The Secretary General earlier this year said by the end of 2030, the world has to be 45% in terms of emissions below 1990 levels. It's projected to be 14% above those levels in 2030. So we have a huge gap. States need to do their part. But what Arunaba's kind of articulating is how important non-state actors can be in pushing states to do their part by demonstrating what can be done on the ground today. And I'm wondering, Catherine, if you could say a little bit more about, examples from Canada or others where you've seen non-state actors make commitments and the interplay between that and the government.
Well, it's actually mutually reinforcing. So just to step back, we need non-state actors. So I feel like it's the worst language in climate, but we need businesses. Let's just take businesses and investors. We need them to do the work, but then we also need regulation. Let's be clear. I was government, so we regulated, and that was important. We got to price some pollution across the country. That will really help reduce emissions by businesses and by investors, and it sends the signal that we need. So I think you need both, and that is one of the things that also we shouldn't forget that is part of the task we have. It's recommending things to to governments as to what they should do. The UK, for example, is going to mandate that every large business, every large investor has to have a net zero by 2050 target. They have to commit to that. And then we're seeing disclosure requirements, so that's all good. So there's so many examples around the world, but that actually have a real impact on people's lives. And I could take it from cities. You could talk about Miami Beach. We saw, measures that they're taking. I remember it's always vague when you're in politics because you do so many different things. But I remember going to the shopping center, and there's a wave, and they're I don't know how it does, but the air flows. So they're not using air conditioning, but it's a lot cooler because it's very, very hot here. That's just one random example, but I'm seeing cities everywhere taking real concrete steps, both on reducing emissions, but adaptation. We shouldn't forget about how important adaptation is. Businesses, it's interesting because Google has been a huge leader thinking, or Amazon, others, thinking about their supply chain. So you talked about this. If you say you're going to be net zero by 2050, it's not just you. If you can influence your whole supply chain and kind of require it that way, that can have a huge impact. It was interesting because I did hear one of those companies, I think it was Google, saying, also, we're going to look at our lobbying efforts. I think we need to shed some light on folks that are lobbying against government policies that we need, but also, if you have businesses saying we've already committed to net zero by 2050, we actually need a price on pollution that will help drive the investment we need, financial flows, but the decisions, the investments in technology. If businesses support that can make a huge impact. So I think the point is, I think we should take it for granted that 80% of people want to do the right thing. There's always going to be 20% that don't and are going to try to ride in the coattails, and that's very bad because then people get cynical. And right now, you can see why we're cynical, because the Secretary General is okay, are we going to be 40% over where we need to be? Or are we actually going to do what we need to do? And so it's really, how do we get there? And everyone can be part of it. So probably many of you are with hopefully the city government, or you're with an environmental organization that can hold people accountable for their net zero pledges, or you're a company. And you can figure out what you can do. You should commit to net zero by 2050 and then really drive decisions. Although you need to do it, it's not just your ESG officer, by the way. It has to start with the CEO, but you have to empower all your employees. But I think this is the real opportunity, but you need discipline. I tell my kids, that's great that you're going to clean your room sometime, but let me tell you what's going to happen. If you don't clean your room by 10 a.m., there's no internet. And if you can imagine 3 teens, that was really catastrophic. So you're holding them to account. You might have little measures in between there to get to there. Okay, you can have breakfast, but then, but I think this is, I'm quite mean, but I'm just disciplined. But I think this is really the opportunity. I think that's what our group really needs to do, and really hold people to account, but for all of us to have this ambition and also figure out how we do it, because it isn't that easy, and we need to see best practices. We need to help folks figure it out.
It reminds me of that story, the policeman, stopped the driver. Didn't you see the red light? And the driver said, I saw the red light, I didn't see you. So
that's a good one.
To really, these commitments are critical, but how we translate that into real change today, tomorrow, how we get on that roadmap that makes sure that those net zero commitments are credible is absolutely essential to solving this climate crisis. 20 minutes goes by so fast, so I'm going to go to each of you with a tweet-style kind of final message to the audience about net zero commitments and accountability. Aranava?
You could do an opera. You could sing for us, or that.
I'll save that for later. When we succeed. Announce, follow up with a pathway, tie your hands behind your back, and have someone else verify what you're doing.
Thank you.
Does it have to be like 200 characters or something? Okay. Look, back to where I started. That net zero commitments are not a get out of jail free card. Do the work, and then we'll build the future we want. Like, it's not that hard. It's just we do need to do the work. But I'm hopeful, and it does bring me hope bringing a conference like this where we have a hugely diverse audience, lots of folks online. So now let's all just do the work.
Please join me, a warm round of applause to Aranava and Catherine. Thank you very much.